The thermometer outside the cabin read -71 degrees. In Yakutia, this isn't just weather, it's a death sentence. When 68-year-old Audrey Hansen stumbled upon a frozen, lifeless lump of fur in the snow, she made a reckless choice that defied the laws of the wild. But she didn't know that the wilderness was watching, and nature never forgets a debt. The cold in Yakutia doesn't just bite, it hunts. It seeks out the smallest gap in your scarf, the tiniest tear in your glove. Audrey Hansen knew this better than anyone. At 68, she was the last resident of the old sector of Oymyakon who hadn't fled south to Yakutsk. Her cabin, a sturdy structure of blackened timber and reinforced insulation, sat on the edge of the limitless taiga, a tiny speck of warmth in a white, frozen ocean. It was January 14th. Audrey remembered the date because the old mercury thermometer bolted to her porch frame had bottomed out. It was hovering at -71 degrees Celsius, -95.8 degrees Fahrenheit. The air was so cold that breath didn't just mist. It crystallized instantly with a sound the locals called the whisper of stars. Audrey adjusted her fur-lined ushanka and pushed open her heavy oak door. She needed wood. The stove was a hungry beast, and if it went out, she would follow shortly after. The silence of the forest was absolute. No birds, no wind. Just the terrifying stillness of a world held in cryostasis. She gripped the handle of her axe, her joints aching. She had moved here 40 years ago with her husband, Thomas, a geologist from Canada who had fallen in love with the brutal beauty of the Russian Far East. Thomas was buried 3 miles away, beneath 6 feet of permafrost. She had just split a log of birch when she heard it. It wasn't a howl. It was too weak for that. It was a sound like dry leaves scraping over stone. A whimper. Audrey froze. In this temperature, living things didn't whimper. They hunkered down, or they died. She squinted through her frosted goggles toward the tree line. The twilight was eternal this time of year, a bruised purple haze hanging over the snow. There, near the base of a twisted pine, was a disruption in the pristine white. Common sense, the voice of Thomas in her head, screamed at her to go back inside. It's a trap, Audrey. Or it's a wolf. Or it's nature doing what nature does. Don't interfere. But Audrey's legs moved on their own. She trudged through the knee-deep drifts, the snow crunching like broken glass under her boots. As she got closer, the shape resolved itself. It wasn't a dog. It was a ball of brown fur, stiff with frost. A bear cub. It was no bigger than a loaf of bread, curled tight, its fur matted with ice. The mother was nowhere to be seen, likely killed by poachers or starved to death in the unyielding winter. Audrey knelt, her knees screaming in protest. She pulled off a heavy mitten, exposing her bare hand to the deadly air for just a second, and touched the cub's flank. It was as hard as a rock. Cold. Dead. "Poor little thing," she whispered, the words snatching away in the steam of her breath. She reached down to brush the snow from its ear, a gesture of respect for the dead, but as her warm finger grazed the stiff fur, she felt a microscopic tremor. A heartbeat? Or just a muscle spasm of the dying? She looked back at her cabin. The golden light spilling from the window looked like heaven. If she took this thing inside, she was inviting chaos. Bears were not pets. They were apex predators. Even a cub could bite through a finger if it panicked. And if the mother was alive, Audrey would be shredded before she reached her porch. The wind picked up, a low moan through the trees. "Thomas would call me an old fool," she grumbled. She scooped the frozen lump into her arms. It weighed almost nothing, just a husk of skin and bone. She shoved it inside her oversized parka, against the wool of her sweater, and ran or moved as fast as an old woman in 4 layers of clothing could move back to the safety of the door. She slammed the heavy timber shut and locked it, leaning her back against the wood, gasping for air. The cabin smelled of pine resin and herbal tea. She pulled the bundle from her coat and laid it on the rug before the roaring fire. It looked like a taxidermy gone wrong. Its eyes were sealed shut with ice. Its breath was undetectable. Audrey grabbed a thick quilt and began to rub the small body, vigorously but carefully. "Come on," she hissed. "You didn't survive -70 just to die on my rug." She worked for an hour. Her arms burned. She fetched a dropper she used for her arthritis medicine, filled it with warm sugar water and milk, and tried to pry the cub's jaws open. She sat back, defeated. It was too late. The wilderness had won. She stood up to put the kettle on, turning her back on the hearth. Scritch. Audrey spun around. The lump of fur twitched. A tiny, black nose wiggled, sneezing out a spray of meltwater. Then, slowly, painfully, two blue, milky eyes opened and locked onto Audrey. It let out a sound that broke her heart, a high-pitched, desperate cry for its mother. Well, Audrey sighed, wiping a sudden tear from her cheek. I guess I'm in trouble now. The first week was a war of attrition. Audrey didn't sleep more than 2 hours at a time. The cub, whom she named Bruno, a name Thomas had once suggested for a dog, they never got hovered on the brink of death. He had pneumonia. His breathing was a ragged rasp that filled the small cabin. Audrey used her old nebulizer, modifying the mask with duct tape to fit his snout, holding him down as he thrashed weakly. She fed him a mixture of high-fat cream, fish oil, and crushed vitamins every 3 hours. Dr. Arthur Evans, the closest thing the region had to a veterinarian, though he was actually a retired dentist, who lived 40 miles away in Tomtor. Audrey, you're playing with fire. Arthur's voice had crackled over the shortwave. If it survives, it will eventually realize it's a bear and your meat. Put it down. He's drinking from a bottle, Arthur. Audrey had snapped back. I'm not killing a baby that fought that hard to live. It's not a baby. It's a 600-pound killing machine in a starter kit. Just be careful. And keep him hidden from Sergei. The mention of Sergei sent a chill through Audrey that had nothing to do with the weather. Sergei Volkov was the local trapper. He was a man who saw animals only as pelts and rubles. If he knew there was a bear cub in Audrey's cabin, he wouldn't see a miracle. He would see a fur coat. By the second week, the miracle happened. Bruno stood up. He was clumsy, his back legs sliding on the wooden floorboards, but his eyes were bright and focused. He decimated Audrey's winter stock of dried fish. She had to start venturing out into the cold to ice fish in the frozen river, chipping through 3 feet of ice just to pull up enough pike to keep his belly full. He followed her everywhere in the cabin. When she sat in her rocking chair to knit, he would curl up on her feet, a living heater. When she cooked, he would stand on his hind legs, wobbling comically, and paw at her apron strings. He was intelligent. He learned how to open the pantry latch with his claws. He learned that the sound of the radio meant Audrey was relaxing, which was the perfect time to attack her wool socks in playful ambush. For 3 months, the cabin was a sanctuary. Outside, the temperatures remained brutal, locking the world in ice. Inside, there was life. Audrey, who had spent years in the grey fog of grief, found herself laughing. She talked to Bruno about Thomas, about her childhood in Oregon before she moved, about the politics of the village she rarely visited. Bruno would tilt his head, listening to the cadence of her voice, his amber eyes soft and trusting. But nature has a way of encroaching. In late March, the sun began to linger longer. The temperature rose to a balmy -30 degrees Celsius, and Bruno was growing. Fast. He was no longer the size of a loaf of bread. He was the size of a large dog, solid muscle and heavy bone. His claws were getting long, tearing into the floorboards, not out of malice, but sheer weight. One afternoon, a heavy pounding shook the cabin door. Bruno, who was gnawing on a deer antler by the fire, dropped it. His hackles rose. A low, guttural growl, a true bear sound rumbled in his chest. "Hush!" Audrey whispered frantically. She pointed to the bedroom. "Go. Place." She had trained him, miraculously, to hide in the back room when commanded. Bruno hesitated, looking at the door, then at her. He chuffed, unhappy, but slunk into the bedroom. Audrey closed the door and threw a heavy quilt over the crack to muffle any sound. She smoothed her hair, grabbed her shotgun just in case, and opened the front door. Sergei Volkov stood there. He was a giant of a man, smelling of cured leather, tobacco, and dried blood. He held a rifle loosely in one hand. "Audrey," he grunted, his eyes darting past her into the cabin. "Coffee?" "I'm out of coffee, Sergei," Audrey said, blocking the doorway. "What do you want?" "I found tracks," Sergei said, his voice grating like gravel. "Near the river. Small bear tracks, but no mother tracks." Strange. Audrey's heart hammered against her ribs. She had been careful to cover their tracks when she took Bruno out for short walks at night. but the wind must have uncovered something. Wolves, probably, she lied. Or a wolverine. Sergei stepped closer. He towered over her. I know what a bear track looks like, old woman. If there is a cub, it is worth money in Yakutsk. Or China. Alive. He smiled, revealing gold-capped teeth. Dead, it is worth less, but still good for gloves. There's no bear here, Sergei. Now get off my porch before I call the rangers. Sergei laughed, a dark, ugly sound. From behind the bedroom door, there was a thump. Bruno had knocked something over. The silence that followed was deafening. Sergei's eyes narrowed. He shifted his grip on the rifle. My heater, Audrey said instantly, her hand tightening on her own shotgun. Old pipes. They bang when they cool down. Sergei stared at her for a long, uncomfortable moment. He looked at the shotgun in her hand, then at her eyes. He saw the steel there. He decided it wasn't worth a bullet today. Check your pipes, Audrey, he sneered, stepping back off the porch. Winter makes things break. Sometimes, beyond repair. He turned and walked away into the snow. Audrey slammed the door and locked it, sliding the deadbolt and jamming a chair under the handle. She rushed to the bedroom. Bruno was sitting amidst a pile of overturned books, looking guilty. Audrey sank to the floor and buried her face in his thick neck fur. She knew then that time had run out. Sergei would be back, and next time, he wouldn't knock. She couldn't keep Bruno hidden anymore. He was becoming a giant. He belonged to the wild, and if she wanted him to live, she was going to have to do the hardest thing a mother of any kind ever has to do. She had to break her own heart to save his life. The decision tasted like ash in Audrey's mouth. She spent the next 3 days preparing, moving with the heavy, frantic energy of a woman arranging her own funeral. She knew she couldn't simply open the door and shoo him away. Bruno was too domesticated. He associated humans with food and warmth. If she released him near the village, he would walk right up to Sergei Volkov or the Rangers, and he would be shot on sight as a nuisance bear. She had to take him to the Black Rock Ridge. It was a treacherous 50-mile trek north, deep into the uninhabited zone, where the taiga thickened into an impenetrable wall of pine and permafrost. It was the place Thomas had always called God's blind spot, a place so remote that even the poachers rarely ventured there. On the morning of the departure, the temperature sat at a manageable -25°C. Audrey hitched the cargo sled to her husband's old snowmobile. It hadn't been run in 2 years, but Thomas had maintained it with religious zeal. After 3 pulls of the cord, the engine sputtered and roared to life, coughing blue smoke into the pristine air. Come on, big boy, Audrey said, her voice trembling. Getting Bruno into the sled was a wrestling match. He was now a sub-adult, weighing nearly 200 pounds. He thought it was a game. He chewed on the leather straps. He batted at Audrey's hat. When she finally coaxed him in with a bucket of honeycomb and dried berries, he sat up like a king in a chariot, looking around with bright, curious eyes. They rode for 6 hours. The landscape of Yakutia rolled by an endless, monochromatic nightmare of white and grey. The wind bit through Audrey's goggles, freezing her eyelashes together, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. If she stopped, she might lose the courage to do what had to be done. They reached the ridge just as the sun began to dip, painting the snow in hues of blood orange and violet. Audrey killed the engine. The silence rushed back in, heavy and ringing. She unhitched the sled. Bruno tumbled out, sniffing the air. The scent here was different, wilder, sharper, smelling of resin and musk deer. He looked at Audrey, expecting dinner. Audrey took a deep breath. She placed the last of the food, a 50-pound sack of dried fish and venison, under a rock overhang. She set it up so he would have to work to get it, to remind him how to forage. Then, she walked back to the snowmobile. Bruno followed, trotting happily at her heels. No, Audrey said. Her voice cracked. She turned and shoved his chest. It was like shoving a brick wall. He didn't budge. He just licked her hand, his rough tongue rasping over her skin. No, she screamed, the tears finally spilling over, hot and instant. You can't come! Go! Get away from me! Bruno stopped. He tilted his head, confused. Why was the nice lady shouting? Why was she angry? He took a tentative step forward, letting out a low, questioning chuff. Audrey grabbed the flare gun she kept in the emergency kit. She didn't aim it at him, never that, but she aimed it at the tree trunk above his head. Bang! The flare sizzled and popped, striking the wood with a hiss of red fire. Bruno scrambled back, startled by the noise and the light. He looked at Audrey with eyes that seemed vividly, painfully human. There was no aggression there, only a profound hurt. A betrayal. "Go!" Audrey sobbed. "Restart the snowmobile." The engine roared. "I don't want you!" She slammed the throttle. The machine lurched forward, spinning around. She didn't look back. She couldn't. She drove blindly through her own tears, the engine drowning out her screams of apology. She drove until the fuel tank was half empty, until the Black Rock Ridge was just a dark smudge on the horizon. Only then did she stop. She collapsed over the handlebars, alone in the middle of the frozen world, wailing into the ice. She had saved his life, but she felt like she had just committed a murder. The return trip was a blur. When Audrey finally pulled up to her cabin, darkness had fallen. She dragged herself up the steps, her body hollowed out. She unlocked the door and froze. The lock hadn't been turned. The door was already unlatched. She pushed it open. The cabin was a wreck. Her pantry was torn apart. The floorboards where she hid her small savings were pried up. Furniture was overturned. And sitting in her rocking chair, sharpening a long skinning knife, was Sergei. "You took a long trip, Audrey," he said softly, not looking up from the blade. Audrey stood in the doorway, the cold air rushing past her. She was too exhausted to be afraid. "Gone," she said. "I sent him away. You'll never find him." Sergei stood up. He walked over to her, grabbing her chin with a rough, dirty hand. "You old fool. You think the wild is a safe place? I will find him. I will track him. And when I skin him, I will bring you the paws as a souvenir." He shoved her aside and walked out into the night, laughing. Audrey locked the door, slid down to the floor, and for the first time in her life, she prayed for a blizzard. She prayed for the snow to cover the tracks, to hide the scent, to bury the path to the Black Rock Ridge. But the sky remained clear, and the stars stared down, cold and indifferent. 2 years passed. They were hard years. Audrey's arthritis worsened, twisting her hands into painful knots. The winters seemed longer, the cold deeper. She rarely went into the village anymore. The rumors whispered that she had gone mad, that she talked to ghosts. Sergei Volkov was still around. He had grown richer, darker. Every time Audrey saw him from a distance, her heart stopped, terrified she would see a familiar brown pelt slung over his shoulder. But she never did. Then came the storm of the century. It hit in early February. The meteorologists in Yakutsk called it a cyclonic anomaly. The locals called it the White Burial. The temperature plummeted to -74 degrees Celsius, a record that defied logic. The wind screamed at 60 miles per hour, turning the air into a sandblaster of ice. Audrey was trapped. Her woodpile was buried. Her windows were frosted over inches thick. The power lines had snapped on the first day. She was burning her furniture in the stove just to keep the temperature above freezing. On the third night of the storm, the unthinkable happened. The heavy oak door of her cabin shuddered. Audrey, wrapped in 3 blankets, looked up. It wasn't the wind. The wind pushed. This was a rhythmic pounding. Thud. Thud. Someone was trying to break in. "Open up." The voice was muffled but unmistakable. "Sergei." "Go away," Audrey croaked. "You'll die out there. My truck died," Sergei screamed, panic edging his voice. Audrey hesitated. He was a monster, but he was a human being freezing to death. She undid the bolt. The door flew open, catching the wind. Sergei stumbled in, but he wasn't alone. He was holding a rifle, and his face was twisted not just with cold, but with a drunken, violent rage. He kicked the door shut. "You took too long." He spat, his lips blue. He looked around the dim cabin. Burning chairs? Pathetic. He moved toward the fire, shoving Audrey roughly. She fell, her hips striking the hearth. Pain blinded her. "You know," Sergei muttered, warming his hands. "I never found that bear. I looked for weeks. I think you owe me." He turned to her, his eyes dead and shark-like. "Get out," Audrey whispered. "No." Sergei grinned. He reached for her. Suddenly, the cabin shook. It wasn't the wind. It was a physical impact, as if a truck had hit the back wall. Sergei froze her. What was that? Then a sound rose above the shrieking wind. A roar. It was a sound so deep, so primal, that it vibrated in the marrow of Audrey's bones. It wasn't the roar of a normal animal. It was the sound of the apex. The window next to the door, reinforced double glass, exploded inward. Shards of glass sprayed across the room. The wind howled in, bringing a cloud of snow. And through the broken window, a massive shape forced its way in. It was a mountain of fur and muscle. It stood on its hind legs, its head brushing the ceiling beams. It was 700 pounds of grizzly bear. Sergei screamed, dropping his rifle. He scrambled backward, tripping over the table. The bear dropped to all fours. Its breath huffed out in great white clouds. It had a scar running down its left shoulder, an old wound from a wolf, or perhaps a fall. It ignored Sergei. It turned its massive head toward Audrey. Audrey, paralyzed by pain and shock, looked up into those eyes. They weren't black beads. They were amber, intelligent. "Bruno?" she whispered. The bear let out a low rumble. He stepped over her, placing his massive body between her and Sergei. Sergei was hyperventilating, pressing himself into the corner. Bruno turned to Sergei. He didn't roar this time. He just opened his mouth. His teeth were the size of fingers. He snapped his jaws, a sound like a gunshot, and took one step toward the man. The message was clear. Leave. Now, Sergei Volkov, the great hunter, the man who feared nothing, looked at the monster in the living room, and then at the broken window leading out into the deadly storm. He chose the storm. He scrambled for the door, threw it open, and vanished into the white void, screaming as he ran. The door banged in the wind. The cabin temperature plummeted. Bruno moved. He didn't chase Sergei. He went to the door and pushed it shut with his nose. He reared up and leaned his weight against it until the latch clicked. Then he turned back to Audrey. He was wild. She could smell the pine, the blood of prey, the scent of the deep forest on him. He wasn't her pet anymore. He was a king, but he lowered his massive head and nudged her hand. He licked the tears from her frozen cheeks. He lay down on the rug, curling his giant body around her, creating a wall of fur that blocked the cold, blocking the fear. Audrey buried her face in his flank, sobbing into the coarse fur. He had come back. Through the storm of the century, through the instinct to hibernate, he had heard her. Or perhaps he had just known. They stayed like that for 2 days until the storm broke. When the rescue team from Oymyakon finally dug the cabin out, they found the door unlocked. They found Audrey sitting by a warm stove, sipping tea. She was alone. "We saw tracks," the ranger said, eyes wide, looking at the giant prints in the snow outside. Massive tracks. "Did a bear try to get in?" Audrey looked out the window, toward the tree line where the forest began. She smiled, a secret, peaceful smile. "No," she said. "A friend just stopped by to make sure I was warm. Sergei was never found. The locals say the White Death took him, but some say they saw tracks, one set of boot prints, followed by the massive paws of a guardian leading deep into the taiga, where justice is served cold." Audrey lived another 10 years in that cabin. And every winter, when the mercury dipped below -50, fresh tracks would appear around her porch. The wolves stayed away. The poachers stayed away, because everyone in Yakutia knew. The old woman wasn't alone. The wilderness was watching, and it protected its own. Audrey's story is a chilling reminder that the bond between humans and animals transcends biology. It wasn't just milk and warmth that saved Bruno. It was love, and in the brutal silence of the Yakutian taiga, love turned out to be the most powerful survival tool of all. Nature doesn't keep score, but it certainly remembers a kindness. If this story gave you chills, hit that like button. It helps us find more incredible stories like this. Do you believe animals have a sixth sense about the people who save them? Let me know in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss a journey into the wild. Stay warm, everyone.